And that's why it was an imperative, as the President described in his State of the Union address, which came at a critical juncture, a most consequential time in our nation's history, that he underscored the necessity of re-engineering the legislative agenda in Washington that focuses not on growing government, but on growing the economy. We have to not only reorient our policies, but we also have to reorient our politics. We have to bridge the divide so that we can achieve the results that American people rightfully deserve and expect, particularly during these precarious economic times. And the failure to apply that formula led directly to the untenable healthcare process and policy that evolved over the last few months and during the course of this last year. Now, I've been immersed in the issue of healthcare since I was chair of the Small Business Committee, started back in 2003. I'm now ranking member. But I held hearings in Washington and in Maine and roundtables. And what I heard first and foremost was about the crushing weight of rising healthcare costs and how it's devastating the ability of small businesses to access affordable plans, most assuredly here in Maine because it's a non-competitive market where few insurers dominate this market. That it was nothing short of a crisis. In fact, the cost of individual premiums in Maine have risen by 271% between 2001 and 2009. Across the country, it's more than 138%. Compare that with wages of 38% and inflation 28%. If Congress had taken the step that I had proposed and legislation that I had introduced in 2003, which was open up the market, allow you to purchase plans across state lines and national associations so that you could leverage your purchasing power, giving you the same advantages as Fortune 500 companies. That would have allowed you to have more competitive, affordable plans. But unfortunately, the special interests were aligned against that proposition. You would have been far ahead of the curve in grappling with those costs. We'd be in a far different position today because small businesses represent 52% of the uninsured in this country. And now you're saddled with the status quo, which is unsustainable and not to mention unacceptable. So fast forward to 2009, and the President made healthcare reform his highest domestic priority. And as a member of the Finance Committee, which has the primary jurisdiction for healthcare, the chairman of the committee decided to establish a template of bipartisanship and creating a group of 6, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, to begin that process on its own with 3 Republicans. And we worked throughout 4 months throughout the summer. We debated policy, not politics. We met 31 times. And to those who argued, what's taking you so long, I repeatedly reminded the President and other colleagues in the Senate that it took 1.5 years to craft and design and enact the Medicare program, and that covered 20 million people. This today, healthcare cost represents 1/6 of our economy. It literally affects every person financially across this country. It's not legislation that's designed to be placed on a legislative fast track. And so, unfortunately, our deliberations concluded prematurely in the Finance Committee in that group of 6 because there was an adherence and a preoccupation with the artificial deadlines and timetables. In this case, it was September 15th. But the basic tenets of what we were discussing were molded into a bill that came before the Finance Committee. We had an open and transparent process with more than 500 amendments. And we spent about 3 weeks on that legislation. I voted for that legislation because I thought the process should continue. It was not a perfect policy, far from it. But we would have an open amendment process that we were promised on the floor of the Senate, so significant improvements could happen. And at the time, I urged for a propensity for building broader bipartisan support to resist the impulse to retreat into the realm of partisanship, Because after all, this was legislation that was going to affect 300 million Americans. And it is not policy to be decided by a partisan one-vote margin strategy so you get a magical 60 to get over that threshold. As I said on the floor of the Senate, just think about Social Security and civil rights and Medicare. Would those landmark pieces of legislation have been woven into the fabric of our nation had they been decided by a one-vote margin? But rather, they were adopted overwhelmingly with bipartisan support. And that's why I urged to build that support. And that's why I thought it was so important to take the time to get it right. And so that since the day that we voted on the Finance Committee package on October 13th, 2 months ensued and the wheels came off. Long gone was the transparency that occurred in the Finance Committee. And now the Finance Committee bill was merged with the Health Committee bill, which had some jurisdiction over health care as well. And that was negotiated behind closed doors for virtually 2 months. And what emerged was a 2,700-page bloated monstrosity, 1,200 pages longer than the Finance Committee version. And it included a first-ever employer mandate requiring employers with more than 50 employees to offer health insurance. It proposed an increase in the Medicare payroll tax by 62%. It created a new entitlement program for long-term care, albeit a laudable goal. But it would be going into the red 5 years after the benefits started paying out. And by the way, they used the benefits, money that was set aside to pay for those benefits for those who participated in the program as a means to calculate the deficit, the reduction that was touted in this health care bill. And only in Washington could that be considered sound fiscal policy. So the American people rightfully became concerned, because this legislation was growing in scope and in cost. And so I had many trips to the Oval Office and many meetings with my colleagues and conversations. I attempted to propose revisions to ratchet back the scale and, of course, the cost of the legislation, to propose revisions that were substantive changes for a more modest, practical approach that would benefit all Americans. But regrettably, there was something else taking place in the Senate. And that was the attempt to peel off one vote at a time in negotiating these sweetheart, unprecedented deals behind closed doors. But ultimately created exemptions from compliance for specific states, either from Medicaid policy embedded in that legislation or Medicare, where the federal government would pick up the cost 100% in perpetuity. In other words, the taxpayer would be absorbing that cost in the other states. It was virtually unheard of.